what comes to your mind when you hear the word theater? Pause and think about it. Maybe words like drama, performance, expression, staging, imagination, and storytelling. So if we were to define theater, I would say theater is a live, collaborative art form where performers, text, and audience come together to create an experience that reflects, questions, and celebrates the human condition. It is both a mirror and a window. A mirror because it reflects society, emotions, and it reflects the relationships within society, showing us who we are. But it's a window because it opens us to new perspectives, new ideas, and worlds beyond our immediate experience. Theater is ever evolving because it's shaped by culture, history, and technology. Yet at its heart, it remains a space for storytelling, expression, and connection, where imagination meets reality on a stage. Theater has evolved over centuries, starting from the very primitive form of theater seen in 2000 BC. Now, this is the theater that you would see in Greece. The oldest places for theatrical performances are in fact found in 4 Minoan palaces on the island of Crete. The oldest of these is estimated to have been built around 2000 BC. If you look at them, you'll see that they are open-air spaces that were built of stone and had a rectangular stage. Then we come to 6th century BC. Some of our modern theatre design principles can be traced back to the traditions that were established in Greece in 6th century BC. This is where portable stages are believed to have been established as well. According to Roman writer Horace, Thespis developed theatre while traveling with a cart that he used as a portable stage. He would set up the stage in any open area where a crowd could gather. Then, as time passed, stationary theatres were built. The first theatre was built in Athens in the market square. Wooden seating benches were built around the stage, giving it a thrust theatre configuration. Then, around 4th century BC, Athens built the first recorded indoor theatre. It was a square building with seating on all 4 walls, with a performance area in the center. It's similar to today's black box theatre. This is what it looks like. In 4th century BC, that is during the Hellenistic period in Greece, Greek cities would compete with each other's theatres, how well the buildings were. It is during this period that we see a raised stage, and the skene building undergoes drastic changes. A skene is a structure behind the acting area that serves as a backdrop. It's usually a changing room for actors, or it's a platform for entrance and exits. Now, this skene was initially portable. It used to resemble a hut. But during the Hellenistic period of 3rd century BC, the skene became 2 stories tall, with a raised stage projecting out from its first story, about 10 feet above the orchestra. So then the image would look something like this. You'd have the orchestra at the bottom. This is where the chorus would be sitting and the singers would be singing. Then, 10 feet above it, you would have the actual stage where the actors would be acting. And then on the second story, that is the skene, you would have the changing area, or the area where actors would enter or exit the scene. In 3rd century, we'd see the beginning of theatre in Rome, after they encountered Greek theatre design as they were conquering Greek colonies in southern Italy. In Rome, theatre structures were built out of wood for specific festivals. After the event was over, the entire structure was taken down. The first stone theatre that was built in Rome was in 55 BC. This was the Theatre of Pompey, and it became the model for Roman-built open-air theatres. Initially, it used arch structures that would allow the audience members to access the halls below the seating area. But later on, they started using hillsides to reduce the cost of having built these substructures. The raised stage was only about 3 feet high. This was significantly lower than the theatres in Greece, whose raised stage was 10 feet high. Through the 4th century, just about every city had a theatre. So many of them were being built that only colonies of North Central Africa and Northern Europe didn't have any new theatres. As the political stability of the Roman Empire deteriorated, many of these theatres were obviously abandoned. After the fall of the Roman Empire, we don't know much about how theatres or performance art in general was doing between the 6th to the 10th century, and that's why we call these as the Dark Ages. But by the end of the 12th century, portable performance spaces were being used in spaces like halls, churches, and even the ruins of Roman amphitheatres. Most early theatre in England evolved out of church services of the 10th and 11th century. It became truly popular from around 1350, when religious leaders encouraged the staging of mystery cycles, which included stories from Bible, and miracle plays, which included stories of the lives of saints. These were written and performed in the language of ordinary people rather than Latin, in order to teach the mainly illiterate masses about Christianity and the Bible. Each play was staged in pageant wagons that processed through the streets and stopped to perform at prearranged sites. By the end of the medieval times, many towns had specific spaces dedicated to public theatre. Permanent purpose-built theatres were first introduced in Ferrara in 1531 and in Rome in 1545. They were soon built all across Europe. And remember, this is the Renaissance period, where theatrical art has re-emerged. Following the Reformation in the 16th century, licenses were issued to companies, allowing them to rehearse and perform in public, provided that they had approval and patronage of a nobleman. Under this, Britain's first playhouse, known as the Theatre, was built in London in 1576. It was constructed by Leicester's men, an acting company formed in 1559 from members of the Earl of Leicester household. Then, over the next 16 years, 17 new open-air public theatres were constructed. Most of these theatres were circular, surrounding an open courtyard where members of the audience would stand around 3 sides of the stage. New companies flourished, and writers were expected to produce a number of plays every year to satisfy demand. Companies became known by the title of the patron's household, and 2 of the most famous companies and fierce rivals were the Admiral's Men and the Lord Chamberlain's Men. William Shakespeare became England's most famous playwright. He wrote 38 plays and numerous sonnets. And it's not just the breadth of his work that makes Shakespeare the greatest British dramatist, but the beauty and inventiveness of his language and the universal nature of his writing. In 1594, Shakespeare joined the Lord Chamberlain's Men as an actor and their principal playwright. Shakespeare wrote many of his most famous works for the Globe Theatre, which was erected in 1599 by Lord Chamberlain's men. A thing to note here is that the Theatre, which was Britain's first playhouse, and the Globe Theatre that Shakespeare wrote in are the same. When the lease on the land at their playhouse, the Theatre, in Sherdwick ran out, the company decided to dismantle the timber frame building and rebuild it on the south bank of River Thames, renaming it the Globe. So please remember that. Now that that's clear, we move on to the 17th century, which would see the court masque theatres. Masque was a form of festive courtly entertainment that flourished in the 16th and early 17th century Europe. The English architect and designer Inigo Jones collaborated with the playwright and poet Ben Jonson to produce a series of elaborate masques for both James I and Charles I. Inigo Jones is credited with introducing into British theatre the proscenium arch and movable scenery arranged in perspective. Proscenium arch is the space which framed the actors on the stage. It makes the stage look more like a painting that you can look at by creating a rectangular frame around it. Both these inspirations came from his travels in France and Italy. Jones' scenery used a series of shutters that slid in and out using grooves in the floor. He even flew in scenery from above and introduced colored lighting by placing candles behind tinted glass. So you'll see that a lot of innovations are happening during the mid-16th and early 17th century. But this doesn't last for very long, since in 1642 civil war broke out in England between supporters of King Charles I and the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell. This is when theatres were closed to prevent public disorder and remained closed for 18 years, causing considerable hardship to professional theatre performers, managers and writers. Illegal performances were only sporadic, and many public theatres were demolished. In 1656, the poet and playwright William Davenant succeeded in producing an all-sung version of the play The Siege of Rhodes in his home. This is widely considered to be the first English opera. So after Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, Davenant and the dramatist Thomas Killigrew were granted royal patents, which gave them virtual monopoly over presenting drama in London. These monopolies were not revoked until the 19th century. The period after Charles II restores his throne is known as the Restoration period, and this period saw the Restoration drama. I told you about how sceneries and elaborate stage machinery were introduced to the English theatre well before the interregnum even took place under Oliver Cromwell. It was abruptly shut down. But once Charles II was restored to the throne, all of this restarted, and it eventually gave rise to blockbuster semi-operas. The grandest theatre at this time was the Duke's Theatre in Dorset Gardens. It stood by River Thames, and steps led up from the river for those patrons arriving by boat. It was in Restoration drama that for the first time women were recognized as professional actresses and playwrights. The most famous playwright was Aphra Behn. A group of women writers, also known as the Female Wits, produced many works for the stage during this time period. As theatre became more and more popular, from the 17th to the 18th century, people in the 18th century started seeing theatre as a popular pastime, and many theatres were enlarged and new playhouses built in London and throughout the country. One of the most successful shows on London stage in the early part of 18th century was John Gay's ballad opera, The Beggar's Opera. In this, Gay recycled popular songs of the day and wrote new lyrics that were humorous and satirical. Shakespeare's play became increasingly popular during the 18th century, but they were reworked to suit the taste of the day. His style was still felt to be too erratic, and poets such as Alexander Pope carefully tidied up any uneven verse lines. Even his ending to King Lear was felt to be too distressing, and Nahum Tate's revised version was preferred to the original. So as the demand for plays increased, more plays began appearing in the market by unknown playwrights, and they would write about very bizarre things, satirizing the political climate of England. One of the most popular ones among these was The Golden Rump, which was a farcical play of unknown authorship, which scandalously suggested that the Queen administered enemas to the king. This play became the chief trigger for Robert Walpole into pushing the case for banning obscene drama from the public arena. And that is the reason why the Licensing Act of 1737 was put into place by him. It had a huge impact on the development of theatre in Britain. It restricted the production of plays to 2 patent theatres at Drury Lane and Covent Garden in London. And it tightened up censorship of drama, stating that the Lord Chamberlain with his examiners of plays must vet any script before a performance was allowed. To get around the restrictions of the 1737 Licensing Act, non-patent theatres during the Victorian era interspersed dramatic scenes with musical interludes. Melodrama and burlesque, with their short scenes and musical accompaniment, became extremely popular at this time. Melodrama became popular from the 1780s. The first drama in Britain to be labelled as a melodrama was Thomas Holcroft's A Tale of Mystery, written in 1802. Melodrama consisted of short scenes interspersed with musical accompaniment and was characterized by simple moral stories with stereotypical characters. There was always a villain, a wronged maiden, and a hero acting in an overblown style. Eventually, the huge growth in demand for theatrical entertainment in the early 19th century made the patent theatre system unworkable. So, in 1843, the Licensing Act was dropped, enabling other theatres to present drama although Lord Chamberlain's censorship of plays remained in place until 1968. So now that we are into the 19th century, we look at the early Victorian drama. This is where wooden stages would be most common in theatres, because they would allow for special effects like trapdoors and elevators. When electricity came about, the stage was able to be illuminated, which turned theatre into an observation rather than just a social event. Both of these technological advances increased the complexity that was available for performances, and various kinds of dramas rose from it. Starting with the pictorial drama. From the middle of the 19th century, theatre began to take on a new respectability and began drawing in more middle-class audiences. They were enthralled by the historical accuracy and attention to detail that was becoming increasingly influential in stage design. Pictorial drama placed great emphasis on costume and reflected a fashionable interest in archaeology and history. The sophisticated technology and machinery of the late 19th century stage produced a succession of sensation dramas in which special effects became the principal attraction. Scene painters worked with expert technicians to produce realistic reproductions of the natural world. The playwright Tom Robertson introduced a new kind of play onto the 19th century theatre scene. His pioneer problem plays dealt with serious and sensitive issues of the day. Robertson's work was considered so revolutionary in style and subject that no established management would produce his plays. Then, by the turn of the 20th century, England saw the emergence of two dominant trends in theatre: the dramatization of contemporary moral and social issues, and an interest in simpler and more abstract staging of plays. Innovative work from abroad, particularly playwrights such as Henrik Ibsen and Anton Chekhov, were also influential in shaping of this new drama. Bernard Shaw was one of the most successful writers of the early 20th century and an outspoken member of the Fabian Society, an organization committed to social reform. He challenged the morality of his bourgeois audiences with a satirical and often humorous writing that included uncomfortable topics such as religion and prostitution. At more grassroots levels, you would see more theatre groups that were aimed at promoting the socialist cause, like the workers' theatre movement that came about in 1926, which was allied with the communists, and it used theatre to agitate for social change. They developed an agitprop style that took songs and sketches onto the streets in an attempt to incite change. Try linking this back with the medieval theatre, which was also something similar, where songs and theatre was taken as processions across streets. But there it was to educate the masses about religion, and here it was to educate the masses about communism. Out of the workers' theatre movement grew the Unity Theatre, whose aim was to further the art of drama by effectively presenting and interpreting life as experienced by majority of people. They believed that drama could move the people to work for the betterment of society. They presented factual information and current events to audiences, as well as satirical pantomimes that challenged the Lord Chamberlain's censorship. Looking at it from a feminist perspective, you would also see the development of the Actresses Franchise League, founded in 1908. It supported the suffrage movement by staging events and readings. The 20th century also saw the repertory theatre movement, which was forged out of the passion and conviction of Barry Johnson and Annie Horniman, who believed that a wide variety of theatrical experience should be made available to people at a price they could afford. During this entire period of drama development, Lord Chamberlain's men were still a very active force that were censoring the media, and thus came the Stage Society, which was founded with the aim of supporting the theatre of ideas. They were frustrated with the conservative nature of more commercial theatres, and therefore the Stage Society presented private Sunday performances of experimental plays that had not been granted licenses by Lord Chamberlain. After a police raid on their first production, it was argued that because these were private performances, the Lord Chamberlain's restriction on Sunday performances in licensed plays was not applicable. The State Society won the case, and other club theatres opened, with members paying a small subscription rather than an entrance fee. These theatres became the home to unlicensed, experimental and controversial plays, a situation that lasted until 1968, when censorship was finally overturned. During this entire period of the 20th century, from the emergence of club theatres and the State Society to abolishing censorship in 1968, 2 world wars had already taken place in the world. And theatre was very different during the wars. For the most part, theatres were impoverished by the Depression and remained conservative both in content of their work and in the staging. The plays of George Bernard Shaw, J.B. Priestley, Noel Coward dominated the scene, whilst Priestley and Shaw had a strong left-wing agenda, but the plays were essentially conservative in form. The Second World War saw a surge in interest in the arts, with many civilians and military audiences experiencing drama, opera and ballet for the first time. This interest led to the establishment of the Arts Council by the Government of England in 1946, with an annual grant to distribute among the arts. This was also the time period when the German playwright Bertolt Brecht was writing, and he developed his theory of the epic theatre in the 1920s, particularly after moving to Berlin. After the World Wars, the West End was dominated by the commercial sector. Farces and whodunits became popular, the most famous being The Mousetrap, an adaptation of Agatha Christie's novel that opened in 1952 and is still going today. This period also saw an explosion of new writing, with John Osborne's Look Back in Anger seen as a landmark for a new generation of young writers who included Arnold Wesker, Tom Stoppard, and Harold Pinter. Small venues continued to promote and support new writing as more experimental production moved into mainstream theatres. These mainstream theatres include George Devine's Royal Court. The phrase "in-your-face theatre" has been applied to many of the young writers who were produced by the Royal Court in 1990s. This aggressive and confrontational style was designed to assault the audience's sensibilities. It explored the gut-wrenching extremes of the human condition and rammed the excesses of contemporary society down its throat. One of the most successful in-your-face productions was Mark Ravenhill's Shopping and Fucking, which opened at the Royal Court in 1996. A shocker in every sense of the word, according to the Daily Mail. During the 50s and the 60s came the theatre of the absurd. It emerged as a dramatic movement in Europe, influenced by existential philosophy and the aftermath of World War II. Then, by the end of the 60s, specifically in 1968, Britain saw the end of theatre censorship, and this led to a surge in alternative theatre movement in Britain. The companies were now free to express any agenda that they chose. Feminist theatre companies began to put on plays that expressed the political agenda of the feminist movement and questioned the male dominance of writers and directors in British theatre. Companies also explored new ways of creating theatre, and many alternative theatre companies rose up. However, in the funding crisis of the 1980s, many alternative companies had their meager subsidy cut, and they could no longer afford to continue. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, companies began to experiment with a more physical type of theatre. These companies wanted to get away from the restraints of realistic and naturalistic drama and create an energetic visual theatre that combined strong design with choreography and physical imagery. Post-2000s till today, theatre companies and groups are producing ever more experimental works that explore social and political questions and challenge conventions of what a performance is and how it should be presented. The new technologies, greater stage flexibility, and changing tastes of today's patrons are driving the need for new equipment and resources to meet the demands. This was all about the evolution of theatre And what exactly is theatre? This lecture has been quite long. So to put everything into perspective and to summarize this entire lecture, I will give you a little note. Early theatre was largely rooted in religious rituals and festivals. Ancient performances were more about communal participation than polished art, often tied to storytelling, mythology, and societal norms. As time progressed, it moved from ritualistic expressions to structured classical plays in Greece and Rome, and then evolved further through medieval morality plays and the grandeur of Elizabethan theatre, where playwrights like Shakespeare transformed it into a medium that explored human nature in all its complexity. Over the centuries, theatre has adapted to cultural shifts, technological innovations, and societal needs, transforming from purely narrative-driven performances into a multifaceted art form where ideas, visuals, music, and movement all converge to communicate with the audience. Today, theatre has expanded beyond the conventional stage. We see it in immersive performances, street theatre, experimental and multimedia productions, and even in digital spaces. Modern theatre challenges traditional boundaries, exploring complex social, political, and personal themes, often inviting the audience to participate, question, and reflect rather than just observe. Yet, despite these innovations, the essence of theatre remains unchanged. It is a space of human connection, where the ancient myths or contemporary dilemmas come alive, allowing us to feel, think, and imagine together. So in essence, theatre is not just an art form. It's a living conversation across time, culture, and emotion, reminding us of our shared humanity while celebrating the uniqueness of every perspective. This is where I'd like to end my lecture today. What I've done in this lecture is I've just given you an overall view of theatre in British history, starting all the way from antiquity, classical antiquity, to modern British theatre. You can also know more about other literary forms like the sonnet, or poetry, or the British novel in these lectures.